In this video, I'm going to show you how to complete a pocket bag, either using your linker or your own knitting machine. So I'm going to start by showing you how to do this on the linker. And here the pocket bag has already been knitted as an integral pocket bag, and I just need to complete the side seams on the pocket. Now I know this bag is 10 centimetres deep, so I can use the measurement chart or scale on my linker to make sure that I fit it to the 10 centimetres, and I'm putting the back section on first and then just rolling the front section on to match. So I'm hooking on that very end stitch from both sides to meet each other. Because this has already been washed and blocked, the pocket bag is already nice and straight and lying as it should do, so that helps. And I'm just putting all of those onto the prongs on my linker, making sure it all looks nice and even, and then just rotating my linker around to get to where my needle and looper are positioned. And I'm knitting the seam with my main colour. My pocket bag is actually in a contrast colour, but I'm going to use the main colour because that's what I want to use for finishing at the end. And I'm just knitting or linking the seam all the way along, and I'm going to go for a couple of inches off the end of it so that I've got enough chain to unravel, and just finish a couple of inches past the end and stop, pop that last stitch off the looper, and I can cut my end and remove it from the machine, well, from the linker, sorry. That's one seam done. All looks good. Chain stitch on one side, running stitch on the other. I just pull that chain back to the very end and tie it off so that it doesn't unravel of its own accord and all come undone. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. On that side there's a couple of ends of the contrast colour, so I'm just wrapping one of those in so that I can cut that off with just one other end that I can use for sewing in for the final finishing. And I'm just tying off that chain, that final chain again. That's both my seams done. So I'm now going to show you exactly the same thing, but how you can do it using your knitting machine rather than a linker. So again, starting at one edge, I'm using my single-ended transfer tool to pick up both of the, or to go through underneath both of the edge stitches at one end, and I'm going to hold my pocket bag out straight and work out how many needles I need to use for the full bag. And I pull out that other end needle and again use my single transfer tool to pull that end needle through. And then I've just divided into sections and picked up on that back edge, and I'm just working along and picking up nice and evenly, and you should be able to see that straight line that's between the very outside stitch and the next stitch in, and I'm taking care to just go through that evenly so that I have a nice straight seam. And you see it in close up, you can see that line again between both of the stitches, and you're just going through that and putting that end stitch onto the needle. And you should be able to see as well that that pocket bag is sitting nice and straight. It's not been stretched, it's not bunched up, it's attached to the needles very nicely and evenly. And then I'm just going to match up the front of the bag, And again, I'm going to pick somewhere in the center so that I'm working evenly all the way across. I don't want to start on one end and work from left to right or right to left, because if you're not careful, you're going to stretch it in one of those directions. And then just the other half to do. I'm just going where the bag naturally sits. I'm not stretching it to the left or to the right. I'm just going in, finding where it's going to be opposite the needle that I want to hook it onto. Then when that's all on, I push both of those edges all the way to the back of the needle. So push the needles all the way out to hold position, and just pop the garment and the pocket bag behind the ribber bed if you've got your ribber bed attached, so it's just hanging down, and add some weights to the pocket bag. And then just making sure I've got my carriage set to main tension and that my carriage isn't in hold position, that it's going to knit those stitches, those needles that are in hold position back in. And I'm just going to knit one row across. All of those have knitted, and you can see a new row of stitches, and I'm just going to cast those off. And here I'm just using my preferred method, which is behind the sinker post transfer tool cast off, and I'm just using that to work all the way along and to cast off all of those stitches. And then when I get to the end, I'm just going to snap the yarn and expand that final stitch and pull the ends through and tie it off, and that's the first seam completed. So now I can remove the weights, take that off the machine, and then just do exactly the same on the other side. And so that's how you join the seams on your machine rather than a linker. And that's how it's looking. All looking okay. There might just be a final bit of tidying up to do around those edges of the pockets. That's what we're going to cover next. So this is going to be the same for both methods, whether you've joined it on the linker or on the knitting machine, it doesn't matter. But you're just going to inspect your pocket, look at your seams, work out what might need. You're obviously going to have to sew any ends in as part of your tidying up, so it's whether you can use any of that sewing in to close up gaps or tidy bits up, particularly those sides of the pockets there. You can see there in the corner there's a bit of a gap. You can see my finger through there. That's going to need a little bit of sorting out, but that's fine because we've got those pink ends that need to be sewn in anyway, so we're going to use that to our advantage. And I'm just threading up one of those into a bodkin needle and going in from one edge to the other. I'm going under a stitch, I'm not going through it, so I don't want my needle to come out on the other side at all. I'm just going under loops on the back of the knitting and using that to help close the gap. So I'm going from one side to the other side, and then I can sew that yarn in and cut it. Only needs 2 or 3 stitches, that's all. And so I'm going to use thread that up onto a needle and just see if there's anything else that needs closing up whilst I've got that there. And I can just see there's another small gap on the back there of the pocket bag, so I'm going to use this again, and I'm going back in under one of the loops, so not through it, not through to the other side, and then choosing one the other side of the gap and going through that, and as I pull it together it just closes that gap, and I'm going in the opposite direction doing the same thing, and then I can sew that end up and cut it. So that's one corner done, or is it? I can see, you see, if I'm being really fussy here, I can see two brown stitches poking through, which to be honest nobody would see, but if I want to make it 100% perfect, I would, I'm going to go back in and just over sew that so that those are a bit more hidden. So I'm just going back in with the pink yarn while I've still got it threaded up, and I'm just going to sew that top edge of the seam. It's also just going to reinforce that seam a tiny bit at what is a big stress point. The edges of the pockets are stress points because they're going to take a lot of the strain every time you're putting things in the pocket or putting your hand in the pocket. So this isn't a bad thing to add a bit of reinforcement. And then I'm just going to need to look at the other side of the pocket, and I've got thread or yarn to sew in at that side as well. So again, I can check and see there's a bit of a gap there, and again I can use the ends of yarn that are there anyway to help close that gap. I've got to sew those ends in anyway, so I might as well use it to my advantage. And again, I've threaded one of them into a bodkin needle, and I'm just going to go through under, not through, a loop on one side of the gap, and then go across to the other side of the gap and go under a loop on that side, and as I pull it closed it just closes that gap. And then I might just go once more underneath the gap, really depends how big the gap is, and then back out under somewhere else, and now I can just weave that yarn in and sew in that end. So I'm just finishing off by sewing it in. And just have another look, see if there's anything else that needs tidying up with that end of yarn, but I don't think so. I think that kind of all looks okay. So then the very final thing is to add some anchor chains at the bottom of your pocket. So these help to secure the bottom of your pocket bag so it doesn't flap around everywhere, but it means it's got some tolerance in it. So again, we were talking about the stress and strain that the pocket bag takes. If you just sewed those corners of the pocket bag directly into the garment, that's going to add a lot of stress to just one stitch wherever that's anchored into the back of your garment, and that's liable over time to pull on that stitch, distort, cause a hole, create a hole, cause all sorts of problems. Whereby if you add an anchor chain, it gives some movement and takes a lot of that stress out of it. So I've just secured, I didn't have a loose end at this end of my pocket bag. Sometimes you might do, depending where your linking seam finished. So I've just secured an end there and created a loop, and then I'm taking my latch tool and I'm just going to create a chain stitch, a row of chain stitch, by using that end and my latch tool to pull through a chain. And I'm going to keep going and create, I don't know, 2 to 3 inches depending exactly where you want to secure it on the inside of your garment. So I just keep going with that latch tool, pulling chains through until I've got it to the length I want. And then when I've got it as long as I need, so like I say, a couple of inches probably, I can just pull that end of yarn all the way through to secure the end of the chain. And then I just need to attach that to the inside of my garment. And I want to do this quite carefully. I don't want anything to show from the other side, so I'm not actually knitting it, I'm not sewing it into the garment. I'm just kind of weaving in the end of that chain under a few stitches so that it gets held in position. So I work out roughly where I want it to go to. You don't want to pull the chain, you don't want the chain pulling too tightly, and you don't want it too loose either. So it's got need to have some movement in it. So I'm just finding the right point, and then I'm just going again under loops on the back of the knitting. I'm not going through stitches at all, and I'm just weaving it under and over 3 or 4 of those loops, and then finishing off the end, and I can snip that. There you go, just checking nothing's showing on the other side, which it isn't, all good. And I can cut that end, and that's one of the chains completed, and then you just do exactly the same thing on the other side, and you can see how the button the pocket bag has a real kind of freedom of movement there, but it's still held in place. That's what you're looking for.